folks, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to talk today about iron deficiency, and the reason I wanted to talk about iron deficiency is because nutritionally it's interesting, but I also wanted to talk about it because it's a very common deficiency, and many people who have what is considered a healthy diet, many people who live in Western nations who eat a reasonably healthy, balanced diet still have iron deficiency, and it's very common in developing and developed nations, and therefore it affects a lot of people, and therefore I think it's worth covering in a video. So I'm going to break down iron deficiency, what causes it, how to treat it, and how you, once you've got it, how you can reverse it in the long term, in order to be able to regain your health. So the first thing to understand is really some of the chemistry of what iron deficiency is. Iron deficiency occurs in different stages. You can have a mild iron deficiency without anemia, and this can progress, and as your iron stores become depleted, you progress into anemia. So the anemic state is not always associated with iron deficiency, but there are health implications for those people who have iron deficiency but don't have anemia. And I would suggest that many people in Western nations actually have iron deficiency. They don't realize it because they haven't actually progressed into full anemia. By the time you have anemia, the symptoms become obvious. You become very physical activity becomes very difficult. You become very tired very easily, and it's at this point that most people would go to see their GP, and their GP would then obviously measure their iron stores. But before that, the symptoms are much more vague, and they're not so severe, and therefore many people struggle on with iron deficiency for all of their lives, possibly in some cases not realizing that they're actually deficient in iron. You need somewhere between 10 and 15 milligrams of iron per day. Women need slightly more because of their menstrual blood loss, but it also depends on body size and also our biochemical individuality. But there is an RDA for iron, and it really depends. I don't like to give figures because there is such a wide variation due to biological variety. But somewhere between 10 and 15 milligrams is usually what's recommended per day, and that's a figure that's come up to be able to maintain iron stores at the required amount in order for normal physiological function to proceed. So how do you know if you've got an iron deficiency? Well, if you go to the doctor and you ask for tests, there are a number of tests that can be done in order to be able to biochemically say that you have low or poor iron status. Now, these tests are very complex, and they're actually quite controversial. There is a lot of discussion on which are the best tests to do. But generally, as you dip into poor iron status, what tends to happen is that your iron stores become depleted, and your iron is stored in your body on a protein called apoferritin, and the combination of iron with apoferritin produces a compound called ferritin. And measuring your ferritin levels, which is your iron, which are basically your iron stores, is one of the first ways that you can determine if your iron status is starting to decline and you're starting to dip into iron deficiency. As well as that, you can also measure the number of transferrin receptors on particular cells in the blood, and transferrin is a protein that transports iron in the blood, and your transferrin receptor level number in your blood is also another way that you can determine your iron status as you start to become depleted in iron. And these are very early stages of iron deficiency. And protoporphyrin is another biochemical test that can be done, and these three tests are done to be able to determine when you start to become depleted in iron. As you progress into iron deficiency and it becomes more severe and your stores become depleted, you can also test, for example, your hemoglobin levels. Your hemoglobin levels will start to drop if you have severe iron deficiency. And there's another test called the hemocrit, which is the total number of blood cells per unit of volume in your blood, that can also be determined. So really, the first three tests, your plasma ferritin levels, your protoporphyrin levels and the transferrin receptor levels are there to determine mild deficiency or moving into deficiency, where the symptoms maybe wouldn't be severe. And then as you start to move into anemia, as your deficiency becomes more severe, you can actually measure the amount of hemoglobin in the blood and the hematocrit. So those are the most common tests you'll probably come across, and those are, if you go to your GP and you do have problems with your iron status, those are the things that he will probably discuss with you, and you can get your results from those tests. It's also worthwhile mentioning the symptoms of iron deficiency, because these are obviously what most people will initially be alerted to when they feel that they possibly there's something wrong. Iron deficiency can cause cognitive, one of the first things it can do is cause cognitive problems, so an inability to concentrate, an inability to memorize things, an inability in general, a decline in general cognitive function is quite common. Hazy thinking, an inability to really focus is another quite common symptom of early stage iron deficiency. And if we look around in the population as general, this is what a lot of people do complain of. I'm a believer that many people are deficient in mildly deficient in multiple trace minerals, iron being one of them. And I believe a lot of the cognitive problems that people, particularly children in classrooms, suffer from is due to possibly a mild iron deficiencies. So inability to concentrate, cognitive problems, and personality changes, mood changes are quite common as a symptom of early stage iron deficiency. Then as the deficiency becomes more severe, there is this inability to perform physical activity because your hemoglobin starts to become affected, and the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood reduces, and therefore your capacity for physical activity actually declines. So those are really the symptoms of iron deficiency. The reason that mental capacity is affected is possibly partly because of the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. The oxygen is obviously the brain is obviously a very metabolically active tissue. It requires a lot of oxygen, it requires a lot of glucose. If you reduce the energy efficiency of your body, the brain's capacity for thinking will decrease. But also iron is required as a cofactor in the enzymes that synthesize both serotonin and dopamine and noradrenaline in your brain, and therefore neurotransmitter levels can actually be affected by iron deficiency. So there's probably two main reasons for that. About 65% of the iron in the body, I think we have about 3 to 5 grams of iron in our body. About 65% of that is bound up in hemoglobin, which is your ability. That means your ability to transport oxygen around the body. About 10% is in myoglobin, which is the protein that steals the oxygen from the hemoglobin in your muscles in order to be able to pull the oxygen into your muscles to be able to fuel your muscular activity. And then about 1 or 2% of the iron is in these as a cofactor in certain enzymes, and some of these enzymes are in the brain, and some of those enzymes are required for neurotransmitter synthesis. So I've done videos before on serotonin production. I've done videos on depression, serotonin, noradrenaline, how all that links together. This is also involved, iron is involved in that, because if you have an iron deficiency, that might be the cause of your neurotransmitter imbalance. Iron is required. You have to have optimal iron function in order to be able to synthesize neurotransmitters, and it's one of the ways that iron deficiency can affect you. So that's worth mentioning as well. It's also worth mentioning that there are other ways to get anemias. There are many different enzymes, enzyme systems, nutrients that are required for the synthesis of hemoglobin, and there are many ways that you can actually get anemia. So just because you have anemia, just because you have this inability to perform physical activity, doesn't mean it's caused by an iron deficiency. It's the most common way that you can get anemia is through an iron deficiency, but for example, you can get anemia through a deficiency in vitamin B12. So it's very important that you have, if you have access to a GP, to a doctor, that you go and see them if you feel that you have low iron status, and you have these tests done to actually ascertain that you are actually treating the right deficiency. Obviously, if you feel that you have low energy levels, inability to concentrate, and you go and see a GP and your iron status is fine, the GP may then test other nutrients in order to be able to see if your possible anemia is caused by a deficiency in another nutrient. So that's worth mentioning to start. Make sure you do actually have an iron deficiency before you try and treat it, because obviously if you don't have an iron deficiency and it's caused by some other nutrient, you're not actually going to get a benefit from any of the things that I mentioned in this video. So let's assume that you do have an iron deficiency, and that would be either a mild deficiency or maybe a more severe one moving into anemia. Who's the most likely type of person to get an iron deficiency? Anybody that loses a lot of blood. So if we go to developing nations, one of the most common reasons that you might get an iron deficiency is if you have a parasite, an intestinal parasite. They tend to cause a lot of blood loss from the intestine, and that's one of the most common reasons why people in developing nations actually have iron deficiencies. If we go to Western nations, that parasites are not common, so there are other reasons. Like I say, females have a higher blood loss than males, so they tend to be at a higher risk of getting iron deficiency. Athletes are at higher risk of getting an iron deficiency than sedentary individuals, and that relates purely to the fact that athletes they have a high requirement for all nutrients, and I've said this in many videos, that if you perform physical activity, you need to disregard the RDAs, you need to disregard all of the recommendations that are made for sedentary individuals, because your body is metabolically more active, it has a higher requirement for nutrients, it has a higher turnover of tissues, and therefore you need don't only need more energy, you need more calories, obviously, you need to drink more water, and you need more nutrients in your diet in order to be able to satisfy those higher metabolic rates. So athletes are at high risk of iron deficient anemia as well, particularly those athletes that perform long duration, high intensity aerobic activity. It would be much less likely for somebody who performed weightlifting, for example, to get iron deficiency anemia than, for example, a female endurance athlete. That would be the very high risk category for somebody that would be that would have higher requirement for iron. So it's worth thinking about what you do in life in order, if you feel like you may have an iron deficiency, it's also worth considering, what group do you belong to. And if you are an endurance athlete, and particularly a female endurance athlete, and you do feel like your energy levels are poor, your ability to concentrate is poor, it could be that you do have an iron deficient status, and therefore, maybe visiting a GP and getting some tests done would be a good idea. But the key thing is to get those tests done, because otherwise it's just guesswork. They're very reliable tests. They do pick up iron deficiency, they do pick up anemia, and it's also very important to actually, rather than let your doctor interpret the test to you, actually get the results of the test yourself. So you get the figures, and then you can go and research what the figures actually mean, and you can actually educate yourself about where you are in terms of your iron status. So once you've determined you've got a problem with your iron, if you've been to your GP, he will probably give you some iron tablets, and they will most probably be in the form of something like ferrous sulfate. Now, this is where I need to talk a little bit about the chemistry of iron absorption, because it relates to how easy it is to treat an iron deficiency, relates to the tactics that you use, and this relates to the form of the iron that you take. If we look at meat contains a form of iron called heme iron. Now, heme iron is what we have in ourselves, in animal tissue. It's made up of heme iron is made up of both hemoglobin and myoglobin. Hemoglobin being the protein that transports iron around the blood, and myoglobin being the protein in skeletal muscle that steals the oxygen from that hemoglobin in order to be able to pull the oxygen into the skeletal muscle for metabolic requirements. When you eat animal tissue, you're effectively eating the red blood cells, and you're eating the flesh, the muscle of the animal, and therefore you're eating the hemoglobin and the myoglobin, and that is called heme iron, because it's the iron is related to a heme molecule, and it's organically bound. And what happens when you consume that heme iron is it is hydrolyzed away from the molecule to release the heme part of the molecule. So the globin is digested away with protein digesting enzymes, releasing the heme iron, which is in a relatively reduced state. It's in the Fe2+ state, and that makes it quite soluble. And this is why there is a higher absorption rate of iron from animal tissue. It's because of the way that the iron is firstly bound to organic molecules, and secondly it's in a state that is reduced. It's in its ferrous Fe2+ state, which means that it's more soluble in the alkaline environment of the small intestine, and that means that it's more likely to go through the glycocalyx of the enterocytes, get to the iron transporters, and then it's much more likely to be absorbed. In plants, the iron is generally in an Fe3+ state. That's a ferric state. That's a relatively oxidized state of iron. Iron can exist in a number of different oxidation states, but in terms of human nutrition, Fe2+ and Fe3+ are the forms of iron that we are interested in. In plants, it's in the Fe3+ ferric state, which is a relatively insoluble form of iron, and also in plants are very good at accumulating iron in their tissues, but iron is actually quite damaging. It's damaging to animals as well, which is why we bind it to proteins like apoferritin and other proteins in the blood. Plants do the same, but they're very good at sequestering the iron away within their tissues, and by doing this, the iron doesn't actually have a negative effect on their cells. Iron it would be a very good oxidizing agent. And you don't want to put lots of iron in a cell on it as iron. You need to bind it to a protein so it becomes less able to cause these cellular problems. And plants are very good at doing that, but unfortunately when we consume the plants, we're consuming the iron, but we're also consuming it collated to these other factors that the plant uses to protect itself from the iron. And it's actually quite difficult for us sometimes to hydrolyze the iron away from these collating agents. So not only is plant iron in this Fe3+, which is insoluble in the alkali environment of the small intestine, it's actually quite difficult for us to sometimes collate the iron, to hydrolyze the iron off these collating agents. So the end result is that what happens is, in the acid environment in the stomach, some of the ferric iron in plants is actually reduced to ferrous iron, but then as soon as it goes back into the small intestine, the alkaline environment, the ferrous iron is oxidized back to the ferric iron. That produces a hydroxide bound iron, which is very insoluble. It precipitates out of solution, and therefore we don't absorb it. So plant iron, although some plants like legumes have high amounts of iron, it's actually quite difficult to get the iron out of the food when we consume it. But there are some tricks you can perform. There is some foods you can eat that actually increase the absorption of iron. Now, when you're given iron tablets by your doctor, you'll be given ferrous sulfate, and ferrous sulfate has been shown to be effective at reversing iron deficiency. So if he gives you those sorts of tablets, they are effective and they will work. The problem is that what most people don't realise is that it takes a very long time to actually reverse an iron deficiency. You may see some effects within 1 to 2 weeks, but it can take 6 months to 12 months in order to be able to fully build up iron stores. And one of the biggest problems I see with people who have iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia is that they don't take the tablets, they don't modify their nutritional habits for long enough in order to be able to fully reverse their iron deficiency. If you are serious about reversing an iron deficiency and you really want to, taking iron tablets, eating a high iron diet, eating foods that are high in iron, you really need to do it for quite a long period of time. And people seem to do it for a short amount of time, they lose interest. And often what happens is people with quite severe iron deficiencies will take the tablets, they'll see an improvement and they think they're better, when really they've only simply moved back towards iron, an adequate iron status, but they're not all the way there. And these type of people, it just comes really from a lack of nutritional understanding. What they tend to do is they dip in and out of iron deficiency and of anemia over a long, a number of years, because they never fully reverse the iron deficiency. So the first thing you need to understand is that this can take a year. It can take even more than a year in some individuals. If you have a severe iron deficiency and you're down towards iron deficient anemia, it can take years to reverse and build up your iron stores. You can't simply do it in a number of weeks. So whatever tablets you're given, you need to take them daily, you need to take them consistently, and you need to take them for a long period of time. Don't get disheartened if you don't feel that your iron deficiency is correcting itself. It will do over time, but you do have to give it time, and that's the first thing to really understand. You can be talking about years. Now, what else can you do? There are better tablets to take than generally the ones that you get from GPs. Ferrous sulfate is in an organic form of iron. It is quite well absorbed, particularly if you do have an iron deficiency. Your body becomes much more able to absorb iron as your deficiency increases. The percentage that of iron that you may absorb if you have no iron deficiency may be about 10%. That can go up to 35, maybe even 45% if you have an iron deficiency. So your ability to absorb iron will increase, and therefore the type of iron that you take as a supplement is less important. However, you can optimize iron absorption by taking iron in a chelated form. Now, there are certain supplement companies that will do iron in, for example, an amino acid chelate such as histidine. And the reason why that is useful is because the histidine is very lightly bound to the iron. What happens is the iron is taken through the stomach and into the small intestine, and there is another protein that's released actually from the enterocytes called mucins. And these mucins are able to actually pass the iron from the histidine into the enterocytes. It's like a transport system to get the iron to the transporters. So chelating agents like histidine, which very loosely bind the iron, are actually able to pass the iron to these mucins, which are proteins, which again are very lightly chelate the iron, and then the iron is passed to the enterocytes. So chelating, although plants chelate iron and they prevent the absorption of much of the iron in humans, molecules that lightly chelate the iron actually increase the absorption. So chelation is not always a bad thing, and this is the next thing that I want to talk about. There are chelating agents that you can take with iron that will increase the absorption rate. So for example, if you have a diet of a certain amount of iron, if you have high amounts of vitamin C and you take vitamin C with that iron, particularly if it's plant-based iron in its ferric state, the vitamin C can chelate with the iron. It keeps it soluble, it passes it to these mucins. These mucins then pass the iron into the enterocytes through the glycocalyx, through the unstirred layer on the side of your small intestine, and this gets the iron to the transporters. So chelating agents like citric acid, vitamin C, lactic acid, lots of acids are chelating agents, but they chelate the iron very lightly. They don't bind very tightly. And this allows the iron to be passed through this kind of transport system into the iron transporters, which then allows the iron to go into the enterocytes and then be absorbed to the blood. So vitamin C is one of the most effective things that you can take with iron in order to be able to increase absorption, particularly if the iron is in its plant form or in its ferric state. Other things that will increase the absorption of iron are protein from animal foods. If you eat a mixture of animal foods and vegetable foods, you'll find that for example, the cysteine protein amino acids in the protein are actually again, they're chelating agents, they're reducing agents, and they will actually increase the absorption of the iron, not just from the animal part of the animal protein, but also from the iron that's in the vegetable component as well. So taking vitamin C, taking plant protein or iron tablets with animal protein, with vitamin C, with citric acid, with these other collating agents, and you can find a list of these collating agents on the internet. There's lots of them that you can take in foods. They're the most common ones. Vitamin C is the one that's been most studied. Cysteine as well can be bought as an amino acid, or obviously you can get cysteine by just eating animal foods. That's okay, obviously, if you're not a vegetarian. If you are a vegetarian, you could just take cysteine as an amino acid. You can buy it in its free form, and it would probably have, it would have the same effect. I think studies have looked at cysteine and looked at vitamin C and compared the two, and they've also looked at taking iron with animal protein, and all of them seem to increase the absorption of iron. So there are things that you can take. There are also things that you need to absorb, because this collation is a double-edged sword. If you collate something lightly, it increases the absorption. However, if you collate something too strongly, you can actually, like I say, you can actually you can form a precipitate which takes the iron out of solution, and therefore it will pass down the gastrointestinal tract and be excreted in the feces. Some of the things that cause this insolubility of iron, well, plants have some compounds naturally within them, and unfortunately, obviously, if you consume a lot of iron in its chelated form from plants, it's very difficult to actually get the iron off those chelating agents. And one of the things that plants use to chelate iron can be polyphenols. Polyphenols are very good at binding to iron, and they form a quite high molecular weight molecule, which is then insoluble, and it is unable to pass the iron to these mucins, which then pass the iron into these transporters. So polyphenols, although polyphenols are very good for the health, and I always recommend drinking lots of tea and eating lots of vegetable foods, if you have a very high polyphenol diet, the chances are that those polyphenols will bind some of the iron and prevent some of the absorption. So if you have an iron deficiency and you want to have the best of both worlds, try and avoid taking your iron around tea and coffee, for example, because tea and coffee is a very good source of polyphenols. Hot chocolate contains a lot of polyphenols. Most plant foods contain high amounts of polyphenols. So it might be worthwhile having a meal where you try and limit your plant foods, and you take your supplement, and you perhaps consume the iron supplement with some animal protein. Try and avoid consuming plant products with that meal in order to be able to maximize the iron absorption from that meal. And then in subsequent meals you can try and maximize the absorption from when you're consuming plant foods concomitantly. But it's very important to understand that polyphenols are very good at chelating iron. Now, some studies have looked at the effects of tea on iron absorption and found no effect, but there are others that have looked at tea. It is a bit controversial. I think the chemistry of polyphenols would lead me to suggest that they do chelate iron, and they do prevent its solubilization, and therefore they would inhibit its absorption. But again, a lot of these studies are very difficult to actually interpret the results. So what I'm saying is, it's very much my opinion. That doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's right. I'm going on what I've read. I'm going on my understanding of the chemistry, and I believe that polyphenols would inhibit iron absorption overall if you had a very high polyphenol level. There's probably a threshold below which the polyphenols don't have an effect. It's to do with concentrations as well, and obviously the amount of iron. If you have very high iron intake, very low polyphenol intake, polyphenols may not have much of an effect. But obviously if you reverse that and you have a lower iron intake and a high polyphenol intake, there may certainly be some interaction there, and therefore it's not worth taking that risk if you do actually feel that if you have got an iron deficiency, particularly if you've got anemia. The most important thing is to get your iron status improved as quickly as possible, so that your health will come back to you and you'll be able to get rid of some of these quite debilitating symptoms. Another thing to take into account when if you're taking iron supplements or you're trying to maximize your iron intake is divalent cations. Iron is a divalent cation. It's absorbed in its Fe2+ state. There are other minerals that also are divalent cations, and they will tend to compete with iron for absorption. And many of these minerals will use the same transporter system. It's based on charge. The proteins recognize charge on the minerals. So zinc, for example, has a similar charge to iron, and therefore it will compete with iron for absorption. So if you have a meal that's high in zinc, you will probably find that the iron absorption rate will decrease. Calcium is also a divalent cation. Magnesium is a divalent cation. Manganese is a divalent cation. So these other minerals are going to compete with iron for absorption. So if you have iron deficiency and you're taking your iron as part of a multivitamin, and it also contains zinc, it also contains manganese, magnesium, calcium, you've got other divalent cations there that are going to compete with the iron for absorption. If you're trying to reverse an iron deficient an anemic state, or just an iron deficient state, you need to take your iron away from other divalent cations. You need to minimize the the competing minerals for absorption on these transporters. So while taking a multivitamin with iron in it would be, that would be fine, you may need additional iron, and you may need to take it away from these other minerals. And of course, that includes foods that contain these minerals. So, dairy products contain calcium. They have calcium ions. When you consume dairy products, you've got a lot of calcium ions there. If you take your iron tablet with a glass of milk, you're really going to affect its absorption. So that's something else to take into account. Based on this, how should you take an iron supplement? When should you take it? Well, if it was me, I would try and take it with away from plant foods. I'd try and take it away from other supplements, and I'd try and take it probably with some animal protein, but with a minimal amount of other foods within that meal. And I would also try and maximize iron absorption from every meal by taking a vitamin C tablet with every meal. So that maybe obviously depends on how much vitamin C you want to take in the day, but if you took a 250 milligram vitamin C tablet with every meal, that would be more than enough to try and maximize the iron absorption from that meal. And if you can eat a mixed foods, which include animal protein and vegetable protein, you'll find that the animal protein will also increase the absorption of the iron from the vegetable protein. And of course, the last thing to say is that cooking foods will maximize the absorption of any nutrient, particularly from plant foods. Plant cells have cell walls. Those cell walls are made of cellulose. We don't have the digestive enzymes to break down cellulose, but our gut bacteria do. The trouble is that our gut bacteria are beyond our iron transporters. So if we consume plant foods, they go through the small intestine. If we haven't broken down those cell walls, we have no enzymes to break them down. They will pass through the small intestine to the large intestine. There they will be fermented. The cellulose will be fermented by bacteria, breaking down and releasing the nutrients. However, we don't have the iron transporters in our colon in order to be able to absorb the iron, so it's too late. So we need to break down the cellulose before the plant cells have passed through the small intestine, and one way to do that is to chew your food very well. So if you can make sure that the food is very well mashed up in your mouth, rather than chewing it lightly, which will obviously leave many of the cells intact. But the other way to do that is to cook the food. So if you cook vegetables, if you cook plant foods, you're much more likely to absorb the nutrients, including the iron, from them. And that is another strategy where you could increase the absorption of the iron. So there's a number of things you can try there. Just bear in mind, if you do have an iron deficiency, and you may not even know that you have an iron deficiency, you may suspect it, it's always worth getting the tests done. That gives you confirmation, and so you know exactly what your iron status is. Once you're aware that you do have an iron deficiency, there's a number of different strategies that you can follow in order to be able to reverse it, but you have to bear in mind it takes a long time. Nutritional deficiencies in general, and this is not just about iron. I've worked with people over the years. When you start people who have generally eaten a poor diet for a long period of time, when you start them with nutrients, you start them with a high quality diet, they don't really see any improvement, maybe for weeks. And many people say, well, this just isn't working. It's the people that stick with it, and a year later they realize, yeah, it's working now. It takes that long for your nutrient levels to build up, for cells to change their status, for your for insulin resistance to reverse, for all these other things that have built up, these metabolic problems in your body. It takes 6 months, 12 months, maybe even longer for them to be able to reverse and change. So starting a high quality diet, taking supplements, you can see improvements to start with, but the real improvements come after years, and you have to follow these diets for years before you realize how bad you were before you started your high quality diet. You just don't realize what a high quality nutrient rich diet can do for you until you've followed it for a number of years, and suddenly you realize that your health has improved, and you wonder how you coped previously. And iron is the same. It takes a long time to build up your iron stores, and there are many biological reasons for that. And obviously it takes people years to slip into iron deficiency, and therefore you would expect it to take years for that iron deficiency to reverse itself, for you to actually get your health back. But it's well worth following, sticking out with these, taking these nutrients for long periods of time, and iron is no exception. So I hope that was useful, and I hope that was those people that have possibly got iron deficiencies, particularly if it's quite serious. I hope that's some useful information that will actually reduce the amount of time it will take for you to return your health. As always, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video. And in the meantime, take care.